at University of Colorado, Boulder. He studies cultural politics and environmental governance, science and environmental communications, science and policy interactions, political economy and the environment, and climate adaptation. His talk engaged scientists, academic climate advocacy and activism in 2020. Should that be 2021?
Yeah, it should be now.
Okay, very good.
When we originally had these plans, it was 2020.
Yes, COVID came in and threw the spoiler.
Well, thank you so much. Are you able to see my screen as I've got it there?
Yep, it's visible. Do you have any moving parts in your presentation?
Nope. In terms of video, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I do not.
Okay, good. Then you're good to go. Bye-bye.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stevan. And I do want to say thank you to Melissa and Morel as well for all the work that's gone into organizing this. As I retraced our conversations with our intentions for this to be a discussion in 2020, I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this really great set of events. And I'm really pleased to be able to follow on Lauren's talk and maybe extend our conversation. And as I understand it, I'm the last one of the day here. So maybe there's a chance at the end to reflect on many of these together as you all have put them, assembled them really impressively. So thank you. At this point, I don't need to dwell too much into the fact that climate change is one of the most prominent and existential challenges of the 21st century. Climate change is a threat multiplier, weaving together many other critical issues like public health, food, foreign policy, poverty, immigration, and so on. And at its heart, it is a collective action problem. It's a consequence of our shared behaviors that cut to the heart of how we live, work, play, and pray and relax in modern life. And so as such, finding common ground on these issues across a political spectrum, Lauren was alluding to this a bit, it's critical for understanding successful, sustainable, and enduring climate engagement and action. But with a tremendous amount of progress that we've made in certain areas of, say, for example, our scientific understanding of intersecting climate problems and issues and challenges, conversations about climate change in our lives still remains relatively stuck. So oftentimes what we have found, this sustained conversation over 10 days is an exception, but we've often found in our everyday lives climate silence, where fear of partisanship, politicization, polarization have kept many people from having everyday discussions with their friends, with their families, with their coworkers. And so while this is, I can point to survey research in the United States out of Yale and George Mason. It also may reverberate into the Canadian context. I'd be very interested to hear more from all of your perspectives after I share my prepared remarks. But here in the United States, Tony Leiserowitz, Ed Maybach, and colleagues have found that 65% of US Americans rarely or never talk about climate change. So that leaves just about 35% who discuss it occasionally or often. And so most fundamentally, the ways in which we can build out further entry points and opportunities to discuss climate change as a pathway to greater engagement and action are what I'm after. And I think that's a lot of the spirit of what Lauren had presented before as well. We'll talk a little bit about comedy and climate change too, but really my focus is going to be to discuss how constructed narratives across advocacy along with activism have woven their way into culture, into these well-worn paths of ideology, of politics, of society, particularly in relation to climate change science policy and our everyday lives. And so in certain instances, especially here in the United States, science can be seen as some kind of left-wing conspiracy, as Steven Lewandowski has studied it and pointed out. And these kinds of accusations, albeit mythical and inaccurate, still have inhabited our psychology, where many relevant expert researchers end up self-censoring or self-silencing. And this self-silencing about climate change has also been found in everyday people as well, as I pointed that out through that survey research. So due in part to these pressures and factors, we've largely been stuck in a state of affairs where researchers, in particular, the focus of what I'm going to talk about here, academic researchers who study these things for a living, I point out, are wary of discussing climate change in their everyday lives. It can simply be that one's comfort level, not all need to or feel comfortable or should speak out, but other factors play roles too. There is not rocking the boat. There is concern about not jeopardizing one's career advancement or to potentially sacrifice self-perception of credibility, of authority, of competence. But we have to confront these. How can we creatively and effectively overcome climate silence, particularly in the scientific community, and spark productive conversations as pathways to action across the political spectrum? So here for this talk, as I've done in a book that I wrote a few years ago, that I'll talk about a little bit as well, I argue that academic researchers have very important and critical roles to play in advocacy and activism in 2021 and beyond. This is not merely through the simple production of new discoveries through research. Facts are established through natural and physical and social scientific ways of knowing about climate change. That's important, but it's not enough. We, this royal we that include researchers, practitioners, everyday people, need to enlarge considerations of how knowledge influence action. And through experiential, through emotional, again, like comedy, through visceral, tactile, tangible, affective, aesthetic ways of learning about climate change, we can enlarge and enhance and enrich these spaces of conversation and then engagement in action. So everyday people across the political spectrum, elected officials alike, typically don't engage with or learn about dimensions of climate change by reading peer-reviewed academic research. And whether it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, or certain papers coming out in prestigious journals, they just don't get to these everyday conversations for a variety of reasons. But instead, many people make links between these formal spaces of science and policy and everyday lives through a range of relevant media, person-to-person communications and experiences. I've written and I've talked quite a lot about news media representations and how that influences public discussion and action. I really want to focus in on these person-to-person communications and experiences here. And as I get dug in with the time that we've got, I want to begin with just a few moments of talking about science as a dominant pathway of knowing, not the only way of knowing, but dominant. This really established itself as climate change moved into the public arena for several reasons that I'm happy to go into in Q&A if you're interested, where climate science, climate change was identified through science as a pollution problem, entering into public discussions in the late 1980s. And really that early framing of the scientific way of understanding this as a pollution problem has in some ways pervaded these ongoing conversations. So when I turn to looking at these dominant ways of knowing, I can point to a variety of different assessment reports, scientific reports. There are certainly many more than I have posted here. One coming up, the 6th assessment report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In full disclosure, I actually am a contributing author to that report. So as I make this mild critique, I understand my own role embedded within these challenges that are ongoing. So with these scientific reports, there's just this risk that you may have heard of falling into what is considered to be this information deficit model logic. So that's to say that if we can just stack up all these reports in front of our grandma or our Uncle Charlie or someone else, that we can get them to see things for what they are and they'll start to make the right decisions. And so searching for that right approach to communication from the science so that people get it is how we fall into this information deficit model trap. Another version is how could we or how should we craft scientific papers so that folks do something to address this pressing challenge? There certainly is importance in scientific ways of knowing to provide insights and trends and changes in the climate. Don't get me wrong there. I sit largely within a large institute of over 800 predominantly natural physical scientists, and I do that because I recognize the importance of those approaches. But these deficits, as they can emerge, these traps, can then be attributed to ignorant people, ill-informed people, lack of support based on their just lack of understanding. And there can be this denigration that starts to take place. And so this hitting people over the head with science, you may have heard this in various forms, such as dumbing it down for the general public, are some of the traps that we can fall into when we move through this dominant way of knowing. And what I really argue here and elsewhere is that that has been a 20th century communication model, but we are in the 21st century. There have been these echoes of Enlightenment thinking where scientific facts, techno-rationality, as Sheila Jasanoff has talked about it, guide optimal decision-making. But really, within these interdisciplinary spaces in the social sciences and humanities scholarship, we know that we must do better. Facts matter, but more science doesn't lead to correct action necessarily. If it were, we'd be doing a much better and more effective job protecting the climate from us, protecting us from the climate. And then we can move on to other important challenges in this world. But despite that we know all this, despite that there have been social scientists and humanities researchers talking about this really for decades, the information deficit model trap persists for several reasons that I'm also happy to elaborate on in the question and answer. So I put up for you a quote from Brian Wynn, which I think is really good at capturing this notion. He plays on this period of time in the 1400s when Charles VI died and was replaced by Charles VII. This is a seemingly contradictory phraseology that points to the notion that despite one thing or belief, concept, idea, notion, view is quote unquote dead, another immediately rises to take its place and continue with the same or similar ordering. So Brian Wynn, who's a science, technology, and society scholar, said the deficit model is dead, but long live the deficit model. We continue to fall into these same traps, even though we do know better. Suzanne Mosier, a very well-regarded social scientist, has said, among many things, that providing information and filling knowledge gaps is at best necessary, but rarely sufficient to create active behavioral engagement. I add sustained and active behavioral engagement here. There are important and additional pathways that we must cultivate to enhance climate change, engagement, and action. So Suzanne Mosier helps to point out that these reports take us to a certain place and we need to expand and enrich our ways of engaging with one another by moving into other more creative spaces. And so in these expanded pathways, facts are established through scientific ways of knowing, good, but then we start to talk about emotional, experiential, affective, aesthetic, the things that I mentioned just a moment ago. So the grim reality is that climate change is a vexing, complicated, difficult threat, requiring a fundamental rethink of how communication and engagement works effectively. And it is more than science. Everyday people and elected officials find some resonance in these expanded places. And so through these complex subpolitical spaces, we can recognize this is not merely an individual set of challenges, but these are the power of collectives and the reality of collective action challenges that I mentioned right at the outset. These expanded engagements more effectively then help confront and reduce tensions that may spread through climate challenges at multiple scales in our lives. So Robert Benford, David Snow have pointed out the critical importance of effective discursive framing for mobilizing social movements. In her book, Communicating Climate Change, Susanna Priest has issued a challenge to move beyond individual conceptions of action to consider the power of social movements and to move beyond merely communicating problems into mobilizing informed and wise collective actions. And so we have all kinds of examples. We've got science marches, we have climate marches, we have youth climate strikes. And many of these were not necessarily organized for a specific cause, but advocacy for the integrity of science, or I should say, not for a specific policy measure, you might say. Organizers of the events insisted the marches were nonpartisan celebrations of the importance of science in our everyday lives. Actually, survey research by Teresa Myers, John Kocher, John Cook, Leslie Beal, and Ed Maybach found that in surveying these marchers, 89% marched because they wanted more evidence in their policy decisions. So climate researchers who participated in these marches for science effectively took steps from talk to action. And these have been, even though they've done this, very oftentimes uncomfortable and unclear demarcations about what is appropriate, what is effective. And so they demonstrated commitment to the general public, raising this in the public view, but there have been many critiques of that. So just thinking about, say, for instance, the 2018 March for Science, Washington Post had reported those chanting, "Science is real, it's not how you feel, but it is about how you feel." And so some of the ironies are embedded in there, with people beating on buckets, marching through Washington, letting these kinds of homemade signs like I'm showing you show their support for empirical research. If you add to this the power of social media that brings many of these images to you and me, we can see that these expanded ways of engagement are very important and effective as a fabric of our 21st century communications ecosystem. So some of these critiques, there are many around, just to give you a few examples, they come from very different perspectives. Sociologist at Brown University, Robert Bruhl, argued that by placing climate scientists as leading spokespeople for climate action has fed into and exacerbated the existing polarized divide rather than bridging it. Meanwhile, a physicist, Jim Gates, opined that such a politically charged event might send a message to the public that scientists are driven by ideology more than by evidence. And as a third example, communications scholar Matt Nisbet had argued that, quote, in the long run, the March for Science may have only deepened partisan divisions while jeopardizing trust and impartiality and credibility of the scientists. Yet, with those three examples of many critiques in mind, many scientists and science advocates have pushed back against these critiques. As one example, Rush Holt, who was for some time congressman, CEO of AAAS, he had said there's nothing philosophically incompatible with science and politics, but there seem to be psychological hurdles that scientists have to overcome. One of them is the misperception that science is pure and politics is dirty. Neither side of that is completely true. It's not a good justification, but it may be something of an explanation. Of course, science is hard work, and people are busy with their laboratory work or their writing or their meetings or whatever. The ethics in the profession is that you stick to your science, and if you're interested in how science affects public policy or public questions, just let the facts speak for themselves. Of course, there's a fallacy here too. Facts are by themselves voiceless. There are many other examples of this pushback. I do think that Rush Holt encapsulates several of these comments effectively here. There is this notion too of exemplification theory. This is what suggests that concrete cases of influential actors, influential academic researchers and scientists grappling with issues like climate change through their actions can significantly influence citizens' awareness and inclination to act themselves. There has been research done that show that these kinds of exertions of academic researchers, of climate scientists taking action in the public arena have found to lower psychological barriers to engagement. And there's been a lot of that of research that shows that inspirational leadership then spurs pro-environmental, pro-social behavioral engagement. Per Espen Stoknes has cited the power of positive and infectious action in the public view through some of his work. and really talking both at the individual level of individual actions, but then also feeding into support for policy action. And furthermore, it's been found that researchers' understanding and engagements are strong predictors of their legitimacy in the public sphere. I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. But one study by Gordon Gauchat, Timothy O'Brien, and Oriol Morosa had said they, quote, given that polarization extends beyond claims about climate change to perceptions of the scientists themselves, science communication strategies may require direct engagement by scientists themselves rather than relying on the surrogates in the news media or elected officials. So together, thinking about this environment, active leadership can arouse first-person perceptions that in turn help to build connectivity that spark conversations, discussions, reflections, leading possibly to meaningful engagement across scales. And so all this leads me up to then what is really the centerpiece of what I have planned for this talk, which is academic climate advocacy and activism. This becomes a chapter in the book that I mentioned about creative climate communication that I wrote a few years ago. And in that, I analyzed flavors of climate advocacy in today's highly politicized communication environment. I traced a current engagement gap through social science and humanities research throughout the book and examined how academic climate advocacy and activism might help to close that gap. So as just a brief history of where we're at and a couple of definitions, I'll try and keep this short, but there's an influential scholar, Anthony Downs, who in the 50s and 60s had really put forward an alluring concept that all humans are rational actors and that they engage in predictable and rational decisions in using the best available evidence in the public arena and in their lives. This perspective was foregrounded and fueled by the work of sociologist Robert Merton, who you can see here a decade before. In short, he had developed these Mertonian norms of disinterestedness, that scientists should not think about their personal positions relative to the science. Rather, they should consider the collective good. Universalism, which is that they should contribute to a growing body of scientific understanding. Communalism, in that scientists should share their knowledge with each other and the world in order to build successfully on it. And then finally, organized skepticism. Scientists should always question scientific claims in order to strengthen both the processes and products of science. As an aside, this organized skepticism from Merton in 1942 is a reason why many people do resist that notion of considering contrarians or denialists as skeptics in several cases. So together with these Mertonian norms, there's this appeal to neatness, elegance, simplicity, and then the requisite engagements that necessarily followed, assembling good evidence-filled arguments to sway these rational people in the world. So among these Mertonian norms, disinterestedness in particular has led to what I see as reticence of relevant expert researchers advocating for evidence-based discussions and decisions in society. And that has been very detrimental to more effective engagement in the public sphere. So focusing in on this Mertonian norm of disinterestedness, just give you a couple of quick definitions of what is advocacy and activism according to Cambridge University Press. And so just looking at this advocacy definition, public support of an idea or plan or way of doing something, whereas activism is the use of direct and public methods to try and bring about especially social and political changes that you and others want. So our realities here are much messier, where decisions and actions are routinely unpredictable, sometimes irrational. We violate these norms on a daily basis in just about every element of our lives. Our theoretical selves quickly depart, these Mertonian selves quickly depart into our everyday practice selves, if you will. So even in the evidence of great information about how our behaviors impact climate change, we nonetheless continue to cling to carbon-based conveniences, like driving gas-guzzling vehicles when we could bike or walk or take public transport. We eat meat when protein from other sources would just do fine. And as Brianne Soldovsky pointed out, we engage in these behaviors and increase our carbon footprints on this earth, even though we know better. So the term advocacy, we can, if I had more time, I could trace it back through history and activism as well. But the reasons that I put up these definitions here is that I want to advance this argument then that there has been this conflation between advocacy, advocates, activism, activists, and what one is advocating for. These definitions themselves don't prescribe particular policy outcomes, but that's where I'm heading with all of this. So in the book, I've developed a typology, which is distinct nodes across the spectrum of chosen engagements to help us corral our thinking about, how one is advocating or engaging in activism across this spectrum. So you can see type 1 advocacy is really just those who choose to stay away from any semblance of advocacy, sometimes because of disinterest in engagement, sometimes owing to confusion, conflation of perceptions of academic advocacy in the public sphere. Some of the things that I mentioned before, concerns about one's legitimacy, worried about one's advancement and promotion, so forth and so on. Type 1 advocacy across this spectrum is another node, which is advocacy for scientific evidence. This approach advocates for intersecting ways in which experiential, emotional, aesthetic, and other ways inform scientific ways of knowing about climate change. So as I mentioned before, the stated claims of the March for Science can be, at least as stated, type 1 advocacy. And then type 2 advocacy can be seen across this spectrum again as advocacy for particular policy outcomes. This approach promotes decisions like environmental policies like a carbon tax or a carbon dividend based on evidence ascertained in various forms to know about climate change. So you can advocate for particular policies and decisions, which is distinct from advocating for the evidence itself. So the conflation that I'm talking about is between largely type 1 and type 2 nodes here. And it contributes to confusion. It contributes to apolitical intellectualism. It contributes to excessive constraint. And then it contributes and increases prevalence of type 0 advocacy here again. And so we just need to remember too that type 0 advocacy here as inaction is effectively then a form of action in the 21st century. So mixed in here certainly are normative ingredients about what might be the right thing or appropriate place for academic researchers to enter into these spaces. But what often results then is anxiety and reticence about what to do, how to navigate these high profile, high stakes, and highly politicized spaces of engagement and the science policy interface and in the public sphere. And so what I've done here, in this particular chapter, I'm pulling together a lot of increasingly great research that's being done. I'll mention a bit of it in just a moment, where I try to put together this to help us work through fundamental considerations of what is maybe a social contract for science in the public arena and how scientists and academic researchers can engage effectively and with more precision and more confidence, essentially. It can provide more solid ground for those of us doing climate research and in academia to stand up for those considerations and stances in the public sphere with confidence. It's not just about frequency of advocacy, but it's actually about effectiveness. John Besley and Anthony Dudo have pointed out that there is a need to, quote, evolve from the focus of helping scientists engage with the public more often to helping them engage more effectively. And I would say also more precisely and more consistent with one's intentions. So in addition to the work that I did in the book, providing examples of prominent type 1, type 2 advocates, you can see Catherine Hayhoe on the left, a well-known climate scientist who's been at Texas Tech and now at the Nature Conservancy. Neil deGrasse Tyson in the center, who is a well-known personality, have largely taken up what I describe as type 1 advocacy, advocacy for scientific evidence. And then on the right-hand side, James Hansen, formerly the director of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, who has since retired and founded Citizens a part of the founding of Citizens Climate Lobby, and has advocated for particular policy outcomes, has been arrested in this case several times. This is not to denigrate type 2 advocacy, but it's rather just to call it for what it is and make this distinction, which often gets conflated into advocacy and activism overall. So in addition to this more conceptual work that I'm talking about in the book, a former PhD student, David Unk, who's now moving to Arizona State University right now, he and I had surveyed natural, physical, and social scientists about their takes on academic climate advocacy and activism. These were professors, postdoctoral researchers, graduate students, and so on. And so we wrote this paper. You can see just the image of the front page in a special issue on everyday climate cultures that was put together by Nathan Farrell, Mike Goodman, and Julie Doyle in Climatic Change. I foreground this with Jane Lubchenco's statement here that scientists need to rethink their roles and responsibilities within society in order to capably confront environmental challenges as they relate to climate change, public health, security, social justice, and the economy. Jane Lubchenco, through a series of talks and lectures that we document in this paper and I document in the chapter, had really been doing some very important leadership work in helping map out this terrain more effectively. Nonetheless, there still remains a considerable amount of work to do. Our survey findings of these natural, physical, and social scientists, it found that among social scientists in particular, women are more likely to agree that advocacy should not be criticized than their male counterparts. We could think about women being much more supportive of advocacy than men in our study. And younger respondents were more likely to be compelled to change by advocates with a smaller carbon footprint, those that are walking the walk, as they say. Secondly, social scientists are more likely than natural scientists or physical scientists to be compelled to change by someone with a smaller carbon footprint. And a third among many findings, actually, just to distill this, is that the effects associated with age differences were stronger than the associated differences with profession. That's just, in other words, to say that age mattered much more than whether one was a natural, physical, or social scientist. So there is this kind of changing environment as we do better work as a community in increasing gender equity, as we do more work in bringing in younger generations of scientists and academic researchers, we are seeing this change for a greater appetite for advocacy in certain ways. We also dug into many qualitative comments. We found some remarkable differences between respondents regarding how they viewed advocacy. Just to give you one example, some took up a perspective that advocacy was very much outside their professional responsibilities, while others, largely younger academic researchers, were pointing to how it is integral to the work they see they're doing professionally. So some of this reticence is then, as I'm indicating, a bit of changing of generational thinking here, that, you know, maybe the dominant tenure and promotion process from the early 1900s, the 20th century, doesn't account for the movements here, particularly around climate change in 21st century communications environments, beyond tenure, which is a narrow way of thinking about it, just any promotion and advancement as a professional researcher. So some often choose to avoid the treacherous waters of advocacy, broadly construed because of the undertow that may be there. And that's why this engagement gap endures. But now that we're in 2021, you know, what I'm arguing here is that we can't miss any more of these opportunities. And I want to point out a really good opinion piece that the editors of Scientific American had published a couple years ago now, called "Go Public or Perish." They had said, they had made the observation that if citizens never hear from legitimate experts, no one can blame them for the indifference to fake science tweets, to decisions by politicians that ignore facts, or cuts to federal agencies that are supposed to be built on good and sound science. And so while this may be a challenge for many of us, this is a challenge that we as academic researchers and scholars need to pick up. This is a part of a body of growing research. John Kocher has done a lot of great work here, where he's actually found through his research that advocacy in these arenas has not sacrificed legitimacy. Similarly, Shazeen Attari at Indiana University has done a lot of great work in these areas, talking about how walking the walk, as I said, that smaller carbon footprint, is effective in influencing others to also start to engage in pro-environmental behavior. She has, with Greg Sparkman, found this notion of what they call do-gooder derogation, which I can also say is, acting better than other people or greener than thou, has blowbacks. They say that advocates, especially experts, are most credible and influential when they adopt many sustainable behaviors in their day-to-day lives, so long as they're not being seen as too extreme. So it's important for us to recognize our own frailties, the contradictions that we're also living in. And according to Attari and Sparkman, this is what can be very effective. There is a danger, just to remind you all again, of getting caught up in this over-individualizing of issues as individual scientific advocates and overlook the importance of collective action. And that's where the kind of work coming through organizations like AAAS, like the American Geophysical Union and others, are important to thinking about the collective engagement of sciences. We are trending in a good direction, but there is certainly a lot more work to be done. So just being cognizant of time, I'm going to maybe move through these final bits and pieces rather swiftly and then open it up for conversation. I hope that sounds okay to you, Stevan.
That's fine.
Great, thank you. How long would you like me to still speak for, Stevan?
How long would I like? We don't have enough time in the conference for me to give you as much as I like. But let's say take another 15 minutes, I think, and then we'll open it to discussion.
Okay, I appreciate that. Great. So I put forward here in front of you, I hope this doesn't look too daunting, but I think it is really important. Annabella Carvalho and Jacqueline Burgess have taken this from earlier anthropologists, as I've noted at the bottom. And above the axis here are movements in the public sphere, below are in the private sphere, left to right is the passage of time. And so if you look at the beginning of this, the encoding processes in the public sphere, there are these important activities at work in framing and power and influence in the public sphere in your voice and that power of framing as these become forms and texts in the public sphere, as you can see at the top. Then in a second moment, as they talk about them, they move in this public sphere into your private lives. This can be attributed to many contextual factors, such as what's going on in the world. I mean, if I do recall that, certain things happening around climate change, politics, and other developments can get overlooked when there are other acute things going on in the world. And so this is part of that dynamic and changing public carrying capacity, if you will. And then in a third moment in our private spheres, we can see how these forms texts then integrate or are resisted in our everyday lives into our lived cultures and social relations, as you can see on the bottom. And the point, even though it is a little bit flawed because it looks like it's going back in time, but the point is that these are iterative, that these repeat, and that all three moments are happening at any one slice and moment in time. And so with this, I bring it to your attention because these moments provide opportunities for everyone. And in the case of what I'm talking about, specifically academic researchers and climate scientists, to be engaging in this power of framing of forms and text, but also influencing a public carrying capacity, or as others might say, a finite pool of worry, as Alka Weber has pointed out from Princeton. And we can also be working with individuals and having those conversations that may change the way in which we are considering our lived cultures and social relations. So the book that I alluded to, I'll just say a little bit about that because this is housed as one chapter in there. I thought I'd talk just for a moment about comedy, just to build off what Lauren had done such a great job presenting before. But I just say a few things about the larger aims of this book. I recognize my own privilege and opportunity from where I sit, and was able to pull together a great deal of social sciences and humanities scholarship to understand and help point to what communication strategies are working, where they're working, when, why, under what conditions, at what scales. And so it was integrating a great deal of research. And the way that I wrote it, there are many, many references to many of the works of people that you've heard from throughout these organized sessions, including Lauren, to help us say that we're not just groping for answers, but as Lauren has mentioned, this is research that's gone into figuring out what works. And I've tried to thread this together for a larger understanding of how these fit together. So the way I've written it, I've tried to provide a bit of a handbook and guide for researchers, for practitioners, for decision makers, and so forth and so on, who are looking to find productive pathways to move forward in the arenas of science, policy, and society. And with this, just pointing out what can be obvious at times, but there is no silver bullet here. We need to support many different ways of engagement, scientific ways of knowing, aesthetic ways of knowing through the arts, emotional ways of knowing across those registers that have been discussed, including comedic approaches, to better engage with more people to foster more conversations leading to engagement and action. So a little bit about ways of learning and knowing. In a chapter that I wrote, I talked a bit about comedy. You know what, I'll go back for a second, and you may have noticed that climate is in parentheses here. That's not just to be sort of cheeky and goofy, but rather there are kind of two main points that I have for doing that, reasons that I have for doing that. One is that I tried to write this in a way that it can be useful for other issues. So creative communications about GMOs, vaccinations, which is big now, nuclear power, stem cell research, and beyond. A second reason, though, is that creatively and ultimately effectively communicating about climate change sometimes may involve not invoking the term climate or climate change. And so when one from academic research is engaging in the public arena, one could choose to talk about resilience. One could choose to talk about stewardship, air quality, water quality, public health. You could expand even further from there and think about legacy. There's some really good work by Ezra Markowitz at UMass Amherst and others who are looking at the power of legacy for compelling action. Think about patriotism, national security, go on and on and on, I guess, as I've done in the book. So with chapter 4, part of it is about comedy, along with a theater professor here at the University of Colorado named Beth Osnes. We've been working on this for about 6 years, trying to complement and build on and expand in certain ways with work that others are doing, like Lauren Feldman and Amy Becker and many others now, which is great. And so we're trying to provide these ways, I guess, as Lauren had put it, of linking comedy and advocacy collaborations. And so through this work, you can see pictures of students. We've had many live performances. We've run an international comedy video competition, which you're all eligible for, should you want to enter into it. And then during the pandemic, so we've also written some other papers about it, really delving into and analyzing this, the potential power of comedy. So what we've also then done, though, in the time of the pandemic is we've moved this into a virtual space. The last 2 years, we've held virtual comedy events on April 22nd, which is Earth Day here in the United States. Last year, we pulled together many of our previous projects. And this year, we actually reached out to and worked with 16 professional comedians to work with our students in virtual writers' rooms to assemble content. Along the way, over the last 2 years, we have partnered with Chuck Nice, who you can see in the bottom right of the lower picture. He is actually co-host of Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I mentioned before. Chuck is a very accomplished communicator, comedian, well-versed in science, and he was a supervisor of these comedians as we guided them and our students through a process of creative content creation. We had tethered the comedy to Project Drawdown book, which some of you may be familiar with, several solutions. I think it's over 100 solutions at different scales to climate change. And so it's one thing to just be funny and talk about, you know, all kinds of goofy things, but it's difficult to have comedy with a purpose, to then wiggle into, poke and prod at some of the incongruities, some of the contradictions that exist within climate science policy and society. But that's the challenge that we put before them. And with these 16 working comedians, some of them, Sasha Stewart, who's in the top left of the upper photo, professional comedian, and Raleigh Williams, who's one down on the right, worked with our other students and produced what I think is some good experimental work. And I'd encourage you, I can always put it in the chat, you can watch the entire show. It's 99 minutes in this case. And with that, we've actually also aired the top video winners that we had that were submitted from around the world. And it's increasingly getting to be where we're getting submissions from all over the place. And it's fascinating to see the cultural interpretations of comedy. And with this, as Lauren was saying, power can flow through comedy, and comedy can open up these productive discussions. Not always, but sensitive to audience, these things can take place. Steven, am I doing okay on time?
Yep, yep, that's fine.
Okay, well, I'll kind of leave it, the comedy piece there, just to note that I fully back and appreciate what Lauren and others are doing, and that we're after that, trying to advance that as well. And just talk about kind of a part where I land on, through analyzing a lot of social science and humanities scholarship, that we can embed academic climate advocacy and research and climate scientist engagement there. That it's very important to be authentic, be aware, be accurate, and increasingly be imaginative and be bold. So I came up with these tenets really through all of the work that I had analyzed throughout the book. The first three are you know, I think pretty fundamental guiding principles. And I often point to Steven Schneider, who was a longtime climate researcher and a wonderful communications climate communicator, who basically said, know thyself, know thy audience, and know thy stuff. And by that, he means know thyself as being authentic, knowing who you are. Know thy audience as being aware of who you're speaking with, who you're in dialogue with. And then last, know your stuff as being accurate about this. And that is important for legitimacy and important for effective communication, so that it helps inform good choices. The last two are about expanding out into these creative spaces, as we've been talking about, particularly this afternoon. And then from this social science and humanities research, consistently important findings that we need to be finding common ground. I think there's a time and there's a place for everything. You know, I get frustrated sometimes. It takes a certain discipline, though, to continue to try and invest and commit to finding that common ground, to listening to others' perspectives, to build those relations of trust that we need to address this collective action problem. Emphasizing the here and now. These may be sounding more familiar to you all the time, instead of the distant polar bear on an iceberg in a place where we're never going to visit, instead of, you know, the future of what's going to world be like in 2050 or 2100. We see these things happening now and in our everyday lived experiences. And so research is pointing to the importance of that emphasis. Also important to focus on the benefits of engagement. This isn't all about sacrifice. This can be about having fun. This can be about changing our energy systems we may not even notice. The lights that are lighting up where I'm sitting here now could easily be renewable, which they actually are, sourced from renewables, from solar panels on my roof, instead of coal-fired power plants. And then fourth of five is creating these spaces of empowerment. I've myself, part of my theory of change is really investing in students, university students, to help create these spaces so that they can bring to bear their perspectives. One need not have a PhD as we can see from youth climate movements, from Greta Thunberg and others, one need not have a PhD to have important perspectives to share here. And
Max,
then last,
I'm glad you said last. Max,
okay.
I suggest that you use this last 5 minutes and then open up the question and answers.
Will do. So 5 minutes, or would you like me to just stop here?
No, you can have a few more minutes. No.
Great. This last point is just that, you know, again, I sort of mentioned the 20th century view of dumbing it down for the public, and the fossils of our communication cling to those ideas, but we really need to smarten it up. We need to turn on its head and draw on the important scholarship that's taking place to more effectively and creatively communicate about climate change. So things are not what they used to be. Believe it or not, that's not news for any of you, I'm sure. Just as one example, so on the left is temperature anomalies. On the right is the upper ocean heat content. If the last cooler than average month was December 1984 in terms of the atmosphere, and that means if you're younger than, I just looked it up this morning, younger than 36 years, 5 months, and 3 days old, you have never lived in a cooler than average month on this planet. That's stunning. There is this new abnormal that we have had to grow accustomed to. And so it's something to keep in mind that things are not the way they used to be. So as young people are coming into this, as climate change has already been in the public discussion, we need to engage in new and different ways as well. Just put up this briefly. These are some of the many groups that are here at the University of Colorado that I'm involved in. And for those interested, welcome you to take a look to learn more about how I've been engaging, not just as a researcher, but then also experimenting in these spaces. And to leave you just with some practical takeaways. First, fundamentally, talking about climate change is something that many have said, Catherine Hayhoe among them, is saying simply talking about this is going to need to take place from academic researchers and so forth. And listening to others' perspectives is also important, finding that common ground, having these conversations and dialogues, having the courage to listen and challenge your own assumptions, challenge your own perspectives, pretty basic things. But beyond that, joining groups, cutting through the clutter, partisanship, and polarization in that way by understanding that this is a collective action problem, not just simply an individual problem. So that is working for systemic change and always considering context. So in closing, just important throughout this whole process of thinking about academic climate advocacy and activism, when climate change becomes the sole responsibility of an individual advocate or activist in place of governments or regulators who might affect significant policy changes through altering production, distribution, consumption, advocacy, while potentially seen as sincere and heroic, are effectively very problematic when seeking to effectively confront these scales of our challenges before us. So we always have to be considering that context. We always have to be mindful of not just the frequency, but the effectiveness of those engagements. And so the last thing, does the scale match the scale of the challenges? Absolutely not. But I'm glad to say that we're all working on it. I appreciate all of you being here, and I really look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maxwell.